guys, and welcome back. And yes, I have the finale. So, 63 and 64. 63 and 64. And yes, I just did the other chapter right before this one. So, gotta take advantage when you sit down. Just do a bunch of them. So, this is the last time I'm gonna do this. At least I have the playlist with the whole book, so you guys can watch it if you haven't, and read along if you have the book. And then when I read my notebook, I will also have then a separate playlist, a separate folder for the notebook. So you can click on the Ickabog if you want to watch I think by then it's going to be 28 videos on this book. And then the other book is definitely smaller, so but I'll have a separate list, for it. So let's do this. Chapter 63. Lord Spittleworth's last plan. When Daisy entered the palace courtyard at the head of the people's procession, she was amazed to see how little had altered. Fountains still played and peacocks still strutted, and the only change to the front of the palace was a single broken window up on the second floor. Then the great golden doors flung open, and the crowd saw two ragged people walking out to meet them, a white-haired man holding an axe and a woman clutching the enormous saucepan. And Daisy, staring at the white-haired man, felt her knees buckle, and the kind Ickabog caught her and held her up. Mr. Dovedale tottered forward, and I don't think he even noticed that an actual live Ickabog was standing beside his long-lost daughter. As the two of them hugged and sobbed, Daisy spotted Mrs. Beamish over her father's shoulders. "Birds alive," she called out. She called to the pastry chef, who was looking frantically for her son, but he had something to do. "He'll be back soon." More prisoners now came hurrying out of the palace, and there were screams of joy as loved ones found loved ones, and many of the orphanage children found their parents they thought were dead. Then a lot of other things happened, like the 30 strong men who surrounded the fierce Ickabog, dragging it away before it could kill anyone else, and Daisy asking Mr. Dovedale if Martha could come to live with them. The Captain Goodfellow appearing on the balcony with his weeping King Fred, who was still wearing his pajamas, and the crowd clearing. When Captain Goodfellow said he thought it was time to try life without a king. However, we must now leave this happy scene and track down the man who was most to blame for the terrible things that had happened to Cornucopia. Lord Spittleworth was miles away, galloping down the deserted country road, when his horse suddenly went lame. When Spittleworth tried to force it onward, the poor horse, which had had quite enough of being mistreated, reared and deposited Spittleworth onto the ground. When Spittleworth tried to whip it, the horse kicked him and trotted away into the forest, where I am pleased to tell you it was later found by a kind farmer who nursed it back to health. Lord Spittleworth was therefore left to jog alone down the country lanes toward his country estate, holding up his chief's advisor robes. lest he tripped over them, and looking over his shoulder every few yards for fear that he was being followed. He knew perfectly well that his life in cornucopia was over, but he still had the mountain of gold hidden in his wine cellar, and he intended to load up his carriage with as many ducats as would fit, then sneak over the border into Pluritania. Night had fallen by the time Spittleworth reached his mansion, and his feet were terribly sore. Hobbling inside, he bellowed for his butler, Scrumble, who so long ago had pretended to be Noby Button's mother and Professor Frodisham. "Down here, my lord," called a voice from the cellar. "Why haven't you lit the lamp, Scrumble?" bellowed Spittleworth, feeling his way downstairs, though it thought it best not to look like anyone was home, sire, called Scrumble. "Ah," said Spittleworth, wincing, and as he limped downstairs. "So you've heard, have you?" "Yes, sire," said the echoing voice. "I have imagined you'd be wanting to clear out, my lord." "Yes, Grumble," said Lord Spittleworth, limping toward the distant light in the single candle. "I most certainly do." He pushed open the door to the cellar where he'd been storing his gold all these years, but the butler, whom Spittleworth could only make out dimly in the candlelight, was once again wearing Professor Frodisham's costume, the white wig and the thick glasses that shrank his eyes to almost nothing. "Thought it might be best if we traveled in disguise, sire," and Scrumble holding up an old Widow Button's black dress and ginger wig. "Good idea," said Spittleworth hastily, pulling off his robes and pulling on the costume. "Do you have a cold, Scrumble? Your voice sounds strange." "It's just the dust down here, sir," and said the butler, moving farther from the candlelight. "And what will your lordship be wanting to do with Lady Islanda? She's still locked in the library." "Leave her," said Spittleworth, after a moment's consideration, "and serve her right for not marrying me when she had the chance." "Very good, my lord. I've loaded up the carriage and a couple of horses with most of the gold. Perhaps your lordship could help carry this last trunk." "I hope you weren't thinking of leaving without me, Scrumble," said Spittleworth, suspiciously wondering whether, if he'd arrived 10 minutes later, he might have found Scrumble gone. "Oh, no, my lord," Scrumble assured him. "I wouldn't dream of leaving without your lordship. Withers the groom will be driving us, sir. He's ready and waiting in the courtyard." "Excellent," said Spittleworth. And together they heaved the last chunk of gold upstairs through the deserted house and out into the courtyard behind, where Spittleworth's carriage stood waiting in the darkness. Even the horse had sacks of gold slung over their backs. More gold had been strapped onto the top of the carriage in cases. As he and Scrumble heaved the last chunk onto the roof, Spittleworth said, "What is that peculiar noise?" "I hear nothing, my lord," said Scrumble. "It is an odd sort of grunting," said Spittleworth. And memory came back to Spittleworth as he stood here in the dark, that of standing in the icy white fog of the marsh all those years before, and the whimpers of the dog struggling against the brambles in which it was tangled. This was a similar noise, as though some creature were trapped and unable to free itself. And it made Lord Spittleworth quite as nervous as it had last time, when of course he had been followed by Flapoon firing his blunderbuss and starting both of them onto the path to riches and the country down the road to ruin. "Scrumble, I don't like that noise." "I don't expect you to, my lord." The moon slid out from behind the cloud, and Lord Spittleworth, turning quickly forward toward his butler, whose voice sounded very different, all of a sudden found himself staring down a barrel of one of his own guns. Scrumble had removed Professor Frodicham's wig and glasses to reveal that he wasn't the butler at all, but Bert Beamish. And for just a moment, seen by the moonlight, the boy looked so like his father that Spittleworth had a crazy notion that Major Beamish had risen from the dead to punish him. Then he looked widely around him and saw, through the open door of the carriage, the real Scrumble gagged and tied up on the floor, which was where the odd whimpering was coming from, and Lady Islanda sitting there smiling and holding a second gun, opening his mouth to ask whether the groom why he didn't do something. Spittleworth realized that it wasn't Withers, but Roderick Roach. When he'd spotted the two boys galloping up the drive, the real groom had quite rightly sensed trouble, and stealing his favorite of Lord Spittleworth's horses, had ridden off into the night. "How did you get here so fast?" was all Spittleworth could think to say. "We borrowed some horses from a farmer," said Bert. In fact, Bert and Roderick were much better riders than Spittleworth, so their horses hadn't gone lame. They've managed to overtake him and had arrived in plenty of time to free Lady Islanda, find out where the gold was, tied up Scramble, the butler, and force him to tell them the full story of how Spittleworth had fooled the country, including his own impersonation of Professor Frodisham and Widow Buttons. "Boys, let's not be hasty," said Spittleworth faintly. "There's a lot of gold here. I'll share it with you." "It isn't yours to share," said Bert. "You're coming back to Joseville, and we're going to have a proper trial." Chapter 64, Cornucopia Again. Once upon a time, there was a tiny country called Cornucopia, which was ruled by a team of newly appointed advisors and a prime minister who at the time of which I write was called Gordon Goodfellow. Prime Minister Goodfellow had been elected by the people of Cornucopia because he was a very honest man. The Cornucopia was a country that had learned the value of truth. There was a countrywide celebration when Prime Minister Goodfellow announced that he was going to marry Lady Islanda, the kind and brave woman who had given important evidence against Lord Spittleworth, the king who allowed his happy little kingdom to be driven to ruin and despair stood trial, along with the chief advisor and a number of other people who benefited from Spittleworth's lies, including Muggrunter, Basher John, Canker by the Footman, and Otto Scrumble. The king simply wept all through his questioning, but Lord Spittleworth answered in a cold, proud voice, and told so many lies, and tried to blame so many other people for his own wickedness, that he made matters far worse for himself than if he'd simply sobbed like Fred. Both men were imprisoned in the dungeons beneath the palace with all other criminals. I quite understand, by the way, if you wish Bert and Roderick had shot Spittleworth. After all, he'd caused hundreds of other people's death. However, it should comfort you to know that Spittleworth really would have preferred to be dead than to sit in a dungeon all day and night, where he ate plain food and slept between rough sheets and had to listen for hours on end to Fred crying. The gold that Spittleworth and Baboon had stolen was recovered, so those people who lost their cheese shops and bakeries and their dairies and their pig farms, their butcher shops and their vineyards could start them back up again and begin producing the famous cornucopian food and wine once more. However, during the long period of cornucopia poverty, many had lost their opportunity to learn how to make cheese, sausages, wine, and pastries. Some of them became librarians because Lady Islanda had an excellent idea of turning all the now useless orphanages into libraries, which she helped stock. However, that still left a lot of people without jobs, and that is how the fifth great city of Cornucopia came into being. Its name was Ickabai, and it lay between Kurtzburg and Jeroboam on the banks of the river Fluma. When the second-born Ickabog heard of the problem of the people who'd never learned a trade, it suggested timidly that it might teach them how to farm mushrooms, which was something it understood very well. So successful did the mushrooms growers become a prosperous town sprang up around them. You might think you don't like mushrooms, but I promise if you tasted the creamy mushroom soups of Ickabai, you love them for the rest of your life. Kurtzberg and Barristone developed a new recipe that included Ickabai mushrooms. In fact, shortly before Prime Minister Goodfellow married Lady Islanda, the King of Mauritania offered Goodfellow the choice of his daughter's hands for a year's supply of cornucopian pork and mushroom sausages. Prime Minister Goodfellow sent the sausages as a gift, along with an invitation to Goodfellow's wedding, and Lady Islanda added a note suggesting that King Porfirio might want to stop offering people to his daughter in exchange for food and let them choose their own husbands. Ickabai was an unusual city, though, because unlike Joseville, Kurtzburg, Barristone, and Jeroboam, it was famous for 3 products instead of 1. Firstly, they were the mushrooms, every single one of them as beautiful as a pearl. Secondly, they were the glorious silver salmon and trout, which a fisherman caught in the river Fluma. And you might like to know that this statue of the old lady who studied the fish of the Fluma stood proudly in one of the Ickabai squares. Thirdly, Ickabai produced wool. You see, it was decided by Prime Minister Goodfellow that a few marshlanders who survived the long period of hunger deserved better pastures for their sheep than could be found in the north. Well, when the marshlanders were given a few lush fields the bank of the Fluma, they showed what they could really do. The wool of Cornucopia was the softest, silkiest wool in the world, and the sweaters and socks and scarves it produced were more beautiful and comfortable than would be found anywhere else. The sheep farm and the Hetty Hobbs and her family produced excellent wool, but I'd have to say that the finest garments of all were spun from the wool of Roderick and Martha Roach, who had thriving farm just outside Ickabai. Yes, Roderick and Martha got married, and I'm pleased to say they were very happy, had 5 children, and that Roderick began to speak with a slight Marshlander accent. 2 other people got married as well. I'm delighted to tell you that on leaving the dungeon, and though no longer forced to live next to each other, those old friends, Mrs. Beamish and Mr. Dovedale, found that they couldn't do without each other. So with Bert as the best man and Daisy as chief bridesmaid, the carpenter and the pastry chef were married, and Bert and Daisy, who had felt like brother and sister for so long, now truly were. Mrs. Beamish opened her own splendid pastry shop in the heart of Joseville, where in addition to fairies' cradles, maiden dreams, duke's delights, folderol fancies, and hopes of heaven, she produced Ickabugs, which were the lightest, fluffiest pastries if you could possibly imagine, all covered with a delicate dusting of peppermint chocolate shavings, which gave them the appearance of being covered in marshweed. Bert followed in his father's footsteps and joined the Cornucopian army, a just and brave man. I wouldn't be at all surprised if he ends up at the head of it. Daisy became the world's foremost authority of on Ickabogs. She wrote many books about their fascinating behavior, and It is due to Daisy that the Ickabogs became protected and beloved by the people of Cornucopia. In her free time, she ran a successful carpentry business with her father, and one of their most popular products were toy Ickabogs. The second-born Ickabog lived in what was once the King's Deer Park, close to Daisy's workshop, and the two remained very good friends. There was a museum built in the heart of Joseville, which attracted many visitors each year. This museum was set up by Prime Minister Goodfellow and his advisors, with help from Daisy, Bert, Martha, and Roderick, because nobody wanted the people of Cornucopia to forget the years when the country believed all Spittleworth's lies. Visitors to the museum could view Major Beamish's silver medal, with Flapoon's bullet still buried in it, and the statue of Novi Buttons, which had been replaced in Joseville's biggest square, with a statue of that brave Ickabog, who walked out of the marshlands carrying a bunch of snowdrops, and in its doing, so saved both the species and the country. Visitors could also see the model Ickabog that Spittleworth had made out of bull skeleton and some nails, and the huge portrait of King Fred's fighting a dragonish Ickabog that never existed outside his artist's imagination. But there's one creature I haven't yet mentioned, the firstborn Ickabog, the savage creature who killed Lord Flapoon, and who was last seen being dragged away by many strong men. Well, in truth, this creature was something of a problem. Daisy had explained to everyone that the savage Ickabog must not be attacked or mistreated, or it would hate people more than it already did. This would mean that at its borning, it would bring forth Ickabogs even more savage than itself, and Cornucopia could end up with a problem. Spittleworth had pretended it had. At first, the Ickabog needed to be kept in a reinforced cage to stop it killing people, and volunteers to take it mushrooms were hard to find because it was so dangerous. The only people this Ickabog even slightly liked were Bert and Roderick, because at the moment of its borning, they'd been trying to protect its ichor. The trouble was, of course, that Bert was away in the army and Roderick was running a sheep farm, and neither of them had the time to sit all day with a savage Ickabog to keep it calm. A solution to the problem arrived at last from a very unexpected place. All this time, Fred had been crying his eyes out down in the dungeons. Selfish, vain, and cowardly though he'd definitely been, Fred hadn't meant to hurt anyone, though of course he had, and very badly too. For a whole year after he lost the throne, Fred was sunk into a darkness despair, and while part of the reason was undoubtedly that he now lived in a dungeon rather than a palace, he was also deeply ashamed. He could see that what a terrible king he'd been, and how badly he behaved, and he wished more than anything to be a better man. So one day, to the astonishment of Spittleworth, who was sitting brooding in the cell opposite, Fred told the prison guard that he'd like to volunteer to be the one to look after the savage Ickabog, and that's what he did. Though deathly white and trembly kneed on the first morning, and for many mornings afterward, the ex-king went into the savage Ickabog's cage and talked to it about Cornucopia and about the terrible mistakes he'd made, and how you could learn to be a better, kinder person if you really wanted to become one, even though Fred had to return to his own cell every evening. He requested that the Ickabog be put into a nice field instead of a cage, and to everyone's surprise, this worked well. The Ickabog even thanked Fred in a gruff voice. The following morning, Slowly, however, the months and years that followed, Fred became braver and the Ickabog gentler, and at last, when Fred was quite an old man, the Ickabog's boarding came, and the Ickabogles that stepped out of it were kind and gentle. Fred would mourn their Icker, as though it had been his brother, died very shortly afterward. While there were no statues raised to their last king in any cornucopian city, occasionally people laid flowers on his grave, and he would have been glad to know it. Whether people were really boarded from Ickabogs, I cannot tell you. Perhaps we go through a kind of boarding when we change, for better or for worse. All I know is that countries like Ickabog, countries like Ickabogs that can be made gentle by kindness, which is why the kingdom of Cornucopia lived happily ever after. And that's the end, guys. The end of the Ickabog by J.K. Rowling. So, what you think? Definitely interesting. Definitely an interesting book. So thank you guys so much for being with me and sticking with me through these 64 chapters for these, I believe, 28 different videos of the Ickabog. Thank you so much. Just please don't forget to subscribe. Stay tuned for my next book. Give me a thumbs up, share, comment, follow me on Instagram, and I will see you